in a culture wars setting.
I think vulgar critiques is such a great way to frame what Suella Braverman is saying and doing. Earlier today, I spoke to one of the organisers of the march taking place in London this Saturday. Chris Nineham is a founding member and vice chair of Stop the War Coalition.
We're calling for, the most massive demonstration, but also one that is very unified and very disciplined and very clear in what our messaging is: the call for a ceasefire, the call for free Palestine, the call for an end to the horrendous and brutal onslaught on Gaza.
The Home Secretary has repeatedly designated these marches as hate marches, which is a very extreme way of characterising a protest that is for peace. How do you respond to that?
It feels like we're in a kind of looking glass world at the moment where, those of us, the hundreds of thousands of people actually representing the overwhelming majority of opinion in Britain who are marching for peace against the killing of innocent people, against the bombing of hospitals, against the bombing of refugee camps, against the what is essentially a kind of ethnic cleansing, obviously, that is going on in Gaza. Those of us who are taking that position are being characterized as hateful on the one hand and potentially violent on the other by people who are supporting that onslaught. It's an upside down world we're in at the moment, and we just have to keep putting our case. And I think that, it's very encouraging, the support we're getting for the demonstrations, but also it's clear that we're winning the argument in general in society. Partly the very reality of the horror that people are seeing on their screens is also obviously winning people over to the position that there has to be a ceasefire. So we are on the majority side here, and that gives us a lot of confidence. With the question of the armistice, which obviously has been the right have attempted to kind of use against us, I think we're also winning that argument, really. I mean, it just seems entirely appropriate for people to be protesting and demonstrating against a horrific war on the anniversary of the end of the First World War, which was obviously one of the most horrific catastrophes of the 20th century. So I think that message is getting across as well. And also, clearly, we've put out from the beginning that we were never, despite the talk from the authorities and from the politicians, we were never planning to march anywhere near the cenotaph. We obviously have the fullest respect for people who are commemorating the end of the First World War, and in a certain sense, the end of the Second World War as well. We have no argument. That is entirely in keeping with the kind of the message that we're putting out. Ceasefire and armistice are the same things.
Were you surprised, though, by Labour's failure to call for a ceasefire? Because that feels like it should be divorced from, our tawdry left or right politics. That feels like a basic tenet of humanity. Stop the fighting. Let's move towards a peace process.
I mean, it is really shocking, yeah. It is absolutely outrageous in the face of the reality that we're all having to watch of, the brutal suppression of the Palestinian people. I mean, it's almost beyond comprehension that anyone would oppose calls for a ceasefire, and in particular, obviously, the leader of the Labour Party, and let's face it, the bulk of the leadership of the Labour Party. I mean, it is shocking. It is absolutely scandalous. They got locked into this, as I say, this kind of obsessive campaign against the left that they no doubt believe is the key to restoring or to gaining popularity, but they're completely misunderstanding the mood in the country, as the last couple of weeks have shown. The most recent opinion polls showed 76% of the population called for a ceasefire. So, they're in a tiny, not a tiny minority, but they're very marginal in terms of overall public opinion in Britain. And, they're completely wrong. This is absolutely the wrong way to go. I mean, what it shows is there needs to be there needs to be a kind of a revival of a serious left project in Britain, in my opinion.
Stop the War has actually been positioned as this extreme radical organisation by Keir Starmer, particularly last year around your campaign against the Ukraine war. How do we get to a place where a Labour leader is characterising an anti-war organisation as something extreme?
I mean, I think it's a product of a number of things. It's a product of, in general, geopolitical terms, I guess the situation has become considerably tenser over the last few years with the war in Ukraine, the growing tension with China, and now the sort of uniquely right-wing and aggressive government in Israel pursuing the Palestinians in what looks like being an almost permanent war. So there's a geopolitical dimension to this, which is creating a lot of stress and a lot of tension in many countries, and definitely in Britain. I also think, obviously, Starmer's kind of and the right in Labour's defeat of the Corbyn project since 2019 is obviously a major factor here. There's a kind of counter-revolution going on inside the Labour Party as a response to what was the most effective left-wing takeover of the party there's probably ever been. And, that continues, and no doubt those two elements, the kind of increased tension around the world and the battle against the left in British society, partly being conducted by the right wing of Labour, have kind of overdetermined the moment. And so I think we're seeing, what we're really seeing is a polarisation in society, with the whole, or pretty much the whole of the establishment united around a hard line, a hard pro-Israeli line, and a hard line against the left. And on the other hand, a massively growing movement in support, in sympathy with the Palestinian people. And I would argue, actually, on the ground, a kind of resurgence of left-wing ideas in a kind of unorganized and maybe quite unfocused way. But certainly this campaign has given that, in the midst of the darkness and the horror of what is going on in the Middle East, it has given that mood of opposition to the establishment. It's given it a focus, and it's given it something to rally around. And let's face it, that has been very effective. And when we have pushed back the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the leader of the Labour Party, the police, it's been quite an incredible few days, really.
Obviously, Stop the War was founded in 2001. It became this huge force ahead of the invasion of Iraq. You were a founding member. You were involved in those Iraq war protests, the biggest Britain has ever seen. Has the attitude to protest coming from the state changed since you helped organise those Iraq war protests?
I definitely think it has changed. It's worth remembering, though, that we did face attempts to stop those protests happening as well. There was 10 days before the biggest demonstration on February the 15th, 2003, there was a call from the Home Secretary at the time, the Labour Home Secretary at the time, that we shouldn't and wouldn't be allowed to march to Hyde Park on the grounds that I think it was too muddy or that we'd ruin the grass. And that was reinforced by the police, and we had a bit of a confrontation over that. And we said, well, I'm sorry. Essentially, we said we are going to march. And I think that added a few 100,000 to the demonstration, because it became a little bit like this one has. It became a demonstration partly about the right to protest. So it had that effect. And we also, when we protested against George Bush visiting later in the same year, they told us that there was going to be a suicide bomber on the demonstration, and they said we couldn't march down Whitehall because the CIA had told them we couldn't get too near to George Bush. And again, we said, no, well, we're going to anyway. And they actually let us. So we've had some of this before, but I have to say that the kind of suffocating establishment consensus and the kind of broad sweep kind of demonization of pro-Palestinian people at the moment is something I would say that is that is basically reached a new level. And clearly, the kind of rhetoric we're getting from Suella Braverman over the last few days is unprecedented, I would say, in British political history. I mean, at least for the last 100 years or so. I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but she has openly said that we shouldn't be allowed to demonstrate, that the demonstration should be banned for no particularly good reason. And she is engaged in kind of, since we pushed her back, she's now engaged in a kind of attempt to whip up popular opinion against us, and in the process, no doubt, mobilise elements of the hard right, the far right, in the streets against the protest. And that is just, this is off the scale, really. And it's very worrying, I have to say. I think it's a very frightening development. Partly it reflects, I guess, or it's a product of disarray in the Tory party. And I think the movement has helped to increase that. But partly it does reflect the existence of a kind of strand of hard right politics in British society that we haven't seen for a very, very long time.
That was Chris Nineham from Stop the War Coalition.